Hi, I'm Reginald Littman, and I have the joy of serving the people of God as a pastor now for almost 30 years. I currently serve at the New Mountaintop Church in West Douglas County. In addition to that, I am also a domestic violence advocate, and I have the sometimes somewhat arduous task of working with batterers who have been court ordered to take a certified domestic violence program. And I fulfill that through my role here at Turning Point DUI School, where I'm privileged to serve as owner. You may wonder, how does one arrive at the intersection of the pulpit and domestic violence advocacy? And I'd like to share my story with you as I talk to you about creating safe, sacred spaces. My grandmother and my father, along with my aunt, are all generational preachers. I am a third generational preacher. To the left there is my lovely grandmother, who was my father's mom. And in the center is my dad. And the third person, of course, is me a few pounds ago. Well, let me just share with you why I have these pictures on the screen. It's not because I want to show you my ecclesiastical background or heritage. It's because on that screen you see three preachers, but you also see three people who have been affected by domestic violence. One was directly impacted physically, while my father was emotionally impacted, and I, in turn, am also the result of this generational thing being passed down. To keep it very short, my grandmother was a minister in our home church. My grandfather was a deacon in our home church. My dad grew up seeing his mom ministering to people while he watched his dad do deacon work in the church, but do dirty work at home. You see, my lovely grandmother, Lily, was abused by my grandfather, who was the deacon in the church. She was physically abused, verbally abused, financially abused, domestically abused, and finally left to finish raising 6 kids all by herself while continuing to do her work in ministry. Well, that impacted my father and his siblings so severely, and in turn my generation so severely, because my best memories, though I did not witness the abuse of my grandmother, my best memories of my grandfather were when he would stop by to borrow money from his kids. And that's the only time we would see him, because he would head back to be with his newfound family. I share that with you because ministry for me merges with domestic violence. In fact, 26 years ago, when I became pastor of my very first church, a little rural church out in the country, small family church, there was an episode that I witnessed domestic violence firsthand for the first time. My father witnessed it in his lifetime while growing up in his mother's house. But I would not witness it until I had turned 24 years old as the pastor of my very first church in a little rural community in Rockdale County. I was there in my office attempting to counsel with a couple who had not long been married. They were having some issues, but I had no idea what kind of issues we were actually in for in this particular counseling session. I did notice that the husband became irritated with his wife. I thought it was an unusual irritation, but I've seen people get upset with each other before. It wouldn't be long before he was telling her, hush, shut up, which is verbal abuse and a sign of domestic abuse and domestic violence. A few minutes later, he reaches over and slaps her on her left cheek. Well, at this point in my life, at 24 years old, wet behind the ears, a brand new pastor, had not attended seminary at this point. The only thing I knew to do was what I had been always taught to do and indoctrinated to do, and that was, let's pray. Well, I discovered quickly that the merger of ministry and domestic violence advocacy is absolutely necessary for all people of faith. Because here's what I found out at 24 years old. Prayer works, but the law is there to really get some things working. So, for the first time, I witnessed domestic violence in my first church, my first office, my first counseling session. And for the first time, I was called into court to testify as a witness. The young man went to jail, and I'm not sure what the outcome of their relationship was. However, for me, it was meaningful to discover new ways to create a safe and sacred space for not only the safety of that young lady, but all people everywhere. And to that end, I created Turning Point. And part of what we do here is Family Violence Intervention Program. It's a passion of mine, and I live it out currently as the chair of the Faith Committee for the Domestic Violence Task Force here in Douglas County. And so I'm glad to have you with me today. I want to share with you what domestic violence is. We all have different definitions and thoughts of what domestic violence really is. But here's a general definition that will help to sort of sync our thoughts. Domestic violence is a pattern of behaviors used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. The word domestic is very important because it only speaks of the intimate partner or those under the same roof. Violence may occur between two neighbors who live down the street from each other or two strangers who are having road rage on the highway. But domestic violence is specifically referring to the intimate partner. It involves physical and sexual violence, threats and intimidations, emotional abuse, and economic deprivation. All of these things are part of domestic violence. There are some specific batterer tactics of power and control that are often used to gain power and control over the victim. There is emotional abuse. There is physical abuse. There is sexual abuse. And this one may shock you, but there is also a such thing as spiritual abuse that is used to gain control and power over a victim. Well, when we talk about spiritual abuse, which is a rarely discussed subject, we're talking about Christian men or men of faith who might actually use the King James Version of the Holy Bible to justify their dominance and control and power over their spouse or intimate partner. That's why this is an important teaching and an important thing to share. You may think that domestic violence is something that is limited to New York City or some large population, maybe metropolitan Atlanta. But the truth is, domestic violence is widespread, so wide that 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence during their lifetime. Look through your family and count 1, 2, 3, 4 among the women. And statistically, you will have identified at least 1 out of every 4 potential or actual or past victim of domestic violence. 85%, as I've stated earlier, are women, but men can also be victims of domestic violence as well. More than 3 women are murdered every day by their husband or boyfriend. Startling statistics. More than 3 women every single day. And domestic violence is a leading cause of injuries for girls and women between the ages of 15 and 44 here in the state of Georgia. Domestic violence affects persons of all ages, all ethnicities, all educational backgrounds, religious persuasions, even sexual orientations and cultures. So, domestic violence is widespread, even here in the state of Georgia. Now, you might have some concepts in your mind about who is the most likely individual to become a victim of battery or domestic violence. And as you look at this screen, all of these lovely young ladies are candidates, which means all women can become a victim of domestic violence. There is no typical victim, there's no typical age. Despite all the stereotypes that people may have in mind about a woman who dresses a certain way or conducts herself a certain way, the truth is, educated, uneducated, rich or poor, middle class, upper class, lower class, all women are at risk for being abused. Well, who is the batterer, you might ask? The truth is, there is no typical batterer. It can be anyone, any man can become a batterer. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person who is obviously aggressive or violent. Many batterers are extremely charming, which is why date rape and violence among teens is extremely high, because a young man may woo a girl and charm the whole family. And then when he starts to isolate her and she does something that he disapproves of, there is the first act of violence between him and his intimate partner. So there are no people who are immune to the possibility of either battering or being battered. In domestic violence advocacy, one of the things that I am charged to share in our program called Men Stopping Violence is the power wheel of control. This wheel was actually created in the 1980s as several domestic violence advocates met with battered women. They wanted to know, what are the means by which men typically batter their domestic partner? And these women provided all of these answers. I want you to notice that in the center is power and control. And they use sexual or physical violence in order to get to the center, which is power and control. When you look at the wheel, you see a number of things there that are used as tools to gain power and control over a woman sexually and physically. They use intimidation. They might demean her in some way to make her look bad or feel bad about herself. And then there is emotional abuse. There is using isolation, where they do all that they can to separate her from her family. Then there's minimizing and denying and blaming, where the finger is pointed at her as the responsible party for the drama that's happening in the house or in the family. Often they will use children to try to turn the children against the mother, to make her feel guilty and to look bad in front of the children so that they can look good. Many times, men use what they call male privilege, which is the idea of patriarchy, which is something that I talk a lot about with in our men's FVIP, or Family Violence Intervention Program. And that comes from the idea of patriarchy that suggests, and it's historic, it suggests that men are way more important than women or children, and that there is little value in anything outside of manhood and malehood. And it's called male privilege. And then they might also use economic abuse in order to control that woman, by withholding resources. In some cases, the women are the ones who work, and yet the man will hold the checkbook or the debit card and not allow her to expend anything from the account that she has worked so hard for. In other cases, he might work and hold back on his agreed portion of supporting the bills and the household. That's economic abuse. In other cases, economic abuse looks like this, where he does everything possible to embarrass her at her job or to prevent her from moving forward. He may show up at the job and have harassing actions that make her embarrassed or lose a job. That is also economic abuse. And then there is using coercion and threats. Forceful words that may not involve a physical strike on her body, but the words and the intimidation, the grimacing looks, the tactics that are used are designed to promote fear inside of that woman. So let's talk a bit about dynamics of abuse. So when we talk about dynamics of abuse, domestic violence is not just a mere disagreement. It is not just a mere marital spat. It's not just an argument. Neither is it just a mere anger management issue. But the abuser is not out of control. They are aware of what they're doing. And in most relationships, the abuse and violence slowly builds. Many times, it's a gradual procedure where he is setting the plot to take control of the woman's life, of her finances, and of her body. Now, you should understand this, that leaving an abusive relationship or even making plans to leave is literally the most dangerous time for a woman who is being abused in the home. It's at that point that if she leaves that home, she is in the most danger. If he finds out of her plans to leave the home, she is in the most danger because he would ultimately lose physical sight of her and visible sight of her and the ability to touch her physically. That raises a lot of anger inside of a man who is a batterer. And so here's a very important point for you to hear and consider, and that is that most victims are killed after or during the process of leaving. These are all things that happen inside of domestic violence. But what I want you to understand is that this is not limited to people who live in a certain continent or a certain country. We're talking about issues that are happening inside of every single congregation. So let's talk real briefly about 4 types of violence. First of all, we should understand that there is resistance violence. Now, what is resistance violence? Resistance violence is committed by a victim in reaction to the abuse that she's experiencing. It is when she is trying to defend herself. She's trying to prevent herself from being harmed, and that is called resistance violence. And then there is something called preemptive violence. That's when a woman is walking on eggshells because she has either experienced something for so long or she is anticipating that there's going to be something that is going to be bad to happen. And so therefore, she is precipitating an end to the tension. And so she prepares her mind for what she might do if she is attacked. Then there's situational violence. Situational violence happens in reaction to the victim's circumstances. There is no pattern necessarily, or it is out of the victim's character to use violence. And then there is mutual violence. Now, it differs from domestic violence because violence or aggressive behaviors may be used, but not in the context of one person using those behaviors to make the other partner feel afraid and controlled. So in other words, there are times when a woman has had enough and she basically retorts right back to the violence that is coming toward her. Our goal in working with batterers through our program and the goal of the Douglas County Task Force on Family Violence is to reach a place of nonviolence. We want to eradicate violence. At the center of this wheel is a very important word that must be ingrained into the mind of men and women who batter, and that is the word equality. You see, equality means that we recognize that men and women were created equal, that men and women both have values, and that a spouse who is female should be heard, should be listened to, and should be respected. And so on this wheel are some of the practical principles that we try and share as we counsel and move men through the Men Stopping Violence and Domestic Violence program in family violence intervention. And one of them is to be non-threatening in their behavior, to be respectful, to trust, and to support, to have honesty and accountability. We emphasize the need for responsible parenting. We talk about shared responsibility, economic partnership, negotiation, and fairness. Now, to those of you who are faith leaders who may be watching, or you are connected to a faith leader, here is some information that you can take and teach your church about how men ought to treat women, or even the reverse, how spouses ought to treat each other with equality. And so this is some very helpful information that can literally become seeds that you plant as you share your messages and teachings with your congregation. So the question often comes up, when a woman is abused, why on earth doesn't she just leave? Why does she stay? Well, there are some primary barriers to her safety that are external and not internal. Batterer's control is most significant in terms of the obstacles that a woman faces. In other words, because she's under the control of a man, that man has her thinking that she cannot live without him. There's a number of common barriers to leaving. There's love. There are many times that women love that man, even though he is abusing her. There's isolation, the fear of being alone. There are promises that he'll change. Honey, I won't do it again. I'm so sorry. And yet that happens over and over again like a sequence. And then there is self-blame. There's denial. There's minimization. There's pressure to keep the family together or stand by your man. There's trauma from childhood abuse that she may have gone through herself, and she doesn't want a repeat for her children. There's cultural and religious beliefs about male and female roles, along with divorce and violence toward women. And those are the things that clergy and faith leaders must look at in order to help women be free. There's also the fact that batterers escalating violence and stalking happens when the woman leaves or talks about leaving. There's the fear that the children will be taken care of. Let's suppose that the man is the provider, the breadwinner. And then if there's a custody case and she can't prove abuse of any kind, there are times when the man will gain custody of the kids. Sometimes there is ineffective response by police and prosecutors and even judicial systems. And sometimes there's a lack of money, a lack of jobs, a lack of transportation, a lack of health insurance, and generally a lack of information and knowledge. The LGBT community has their own set of barriers for why they stay in abusive relationships, and they're on the screen. Victims may feel like they will be outed if they leave. They may feel like they will have a lack of legal rights to assets or money or houses and a host of other things. Chemical dependent people also have their own reasons and their own challenges with leaving, as do those with mental health issues. And there are a number of them that are on the screen as well. So when we think about it, the bottom line is that battered women stay or return in order to survive. Leaving is a process, not an event. And not every person who is in an abusive relationship wants to leave, but they all want the abuse to stop. There are many people who are experiencing a spiritual crisis, and because of that, they will not exit a dangerous relationship. They may look to their minister, to their priest, or to their religious leader for guidance and assistance, whether or not they openly disclose that they are actually being abused. How the faith community responds or does not respond to domestic violence can create roadblocks to safety for victims or resources for their healing and for their survival. And what we want to do is produce resources. Reverend Mary Fortune said this: none of us helpers should ever put a battered woman in the position of having to choose between her safety and the support of her religious community. She needs both the safety and support of her church or synagogue, and it's up to us to provide that. So here are a few tips on how you can recognize and respond to domestic violence. If you notice that conversations are easier when they have already been brought up. For instance, in your church or place of worship, you can place posters in the women's restroom with hotline numbers. You can have literature in your literature racks or in your church newsletter that address domestic violence, or just have the hotline number there. In your sermons, you can include these tips on equality, on loving one another, on respecting one another. Many spiritual men like to rest on the woman belongs to the man and her body belongs to the man. But they bypass that the man ought to love the woman even as Christ loved the church, giving his life. So these are some ideas that can be used. And these conversations should take place in private locations and in a very respectful manner. So here's some signs and symptoms of a person who may be a victim of domestic violence. They turn down social invitations, miss obligations, seems more withdrawn or isolated, or seems to have less confidence or lost confidence. They become anxious or unusually quiet around their partner. Unexplained injuries. Sometimes they will wear long sleeves up to the neck and down to the wrist in the month of August. They might be attempting to cover up some physical ailment or some physical damage that has happened to them as a result of their spouse. So what do you say? Remain calm. Listen to them, believe what they're saying to you, and say words like, I care about you, I'm worried for your safety. Point out some of the specific behaviors or incidents that concern you, like I saw your partner grab your arm very hard and march you across the room. Never make blaming statements like I would never let someone put their hands on me. And please don't give advice. Instead, say, what do you think you should do? You're the one who is in the situation and you know the situation best. That's an easy way to be sued, by giving advice. And if they follow the advice and it doesn't work out to their liking, they can turn around and sue you for malpractice. So you want to help them decide what is the best route for them to take for their own lives. And please don't tell others unless you have permission. Take a non-judgmental position as a reliable person. Tell them I'll be there for you, even if I don't understand all of your choices. Ask if they would like for you to share some scriptures with them. But don't suggest that she just up and leaves. Remember, leaving is the most dangerous time. And then you can also make referrals. There are experts and resources all over the community that you can connect with. And we'll be happy to provide you with those resources, such as Share House and such as the Douglas County Task Force on Family Violence. And for those men who batter, you as a faith leader are actually able to refer them to a family violence intervention program. We would be happy to help you with that. You want to make those warm referrals, which means I know Alice or I know this person. And so connecting with the community, joining in with the Douglas County Task Force on Family Violence or whatever county you live in will help you to create those kinds of relationships that you'll be able to know experts in the field that you can refer your church member to. There's a 24-hour hotline here in the state of Georgia, and it's 1-800-33-HAVEN. That's 1-800-334-2836. And they also speak Spanish. These are some of the things that you can do as a faith leader to aid those people that you serve in your church. And it's so important. What else can we do? Well, we can also update our library materials. We can include materials in our church library or our office library that deal with violence and equality and those types of things. We can invite speakers to our church for events. We can train our staff on the dynamics of domestic violence. Take this PowerPoint and personalize it and use it so that you can share it. Hang flyers in the bathroom, especially in the women's restroom, regarding domestic violence services. You can put brochures and other literature on your resources, your church Facebook page, your church YouTube page, your website, if you have a newsletter. And you can always put the hotline number in places where your people can find it. You want to also participate in community-wide events to address domestic violence. Be a part of your task force in your community and be an active voice in advocacy for domestic violence. Mention domestic violence in your prayers, in your newsletters, in your sermons. Preach about domestic violence and healthy relationships. Many pastors find it difficult to think about preaching about domestic violence. Well, preach about healthy relationships and what does a healthy marriage look like. Well, also, you could also establish an emergency expense fund for victims and their families. You can establish a safer home fund that would be funds to be able to change locks on door when a woman moves. You can collect items for your local domestic violence program or shelter. Just simply ask them what they need. And also, you can care for individuals and family by developing protocols for response to domestic violence. If this happens, this is what we do, training your staff that way. Premarital counseling on equality and conflict resolution, on power and control. You can include that in your premarital counseling. That will help set a good foundation for marriage. And then refer them to the hotlines, refer them to the shelters. Refuse couples counseling for domestic violence. No. Send them to those who specialize in those areas. Otherwise, you may be seen as slanted biblically and become a part of the blame for the situation continuing. You want to create plans for holding abusers accountable. Listen, believe, be non-judgmental. Listen, they are the experts on their situations. Share these confidential hotlines. There's a Georgia hotline and a national hotline. And I definitely hope that you have gotten a lot out of this. If we can help you in any way, we're only a phone call away. Please remember us, and we will remember you in our prayers.